I was raised Catholic, but fell away in my teenage years as so many do, and I personally haven't looked back. I am also a fourth-year medical student, going into psychiatry. Science is my life. I am one of those people who believe that there is a scientific reason behind everything. Mediums use cold reading and distractions. Psychics use sleight of hand and get information ahead of time. And there are no such thing as miracles. I had a patient today in a family medical practice who came in to talk about management of his chronic conditions. Long story short, he ended up telling me that he has had special powers that have been passed down in his family from God that allowed him to rid the world of demons. Okay, great, a psych case, right? I've had patients tell me that the government put cameras in their walls and that they were Jesus and could tell their followers apart by shaping in their eyes. This is nothing I'm not used to. He told me very detailed descriptions of angels that travelled with him in their history. He talked about how what he did, travelling and performing exorcisms, was killing him, but he owed it to humanity to continue, and to help his teenage son develop his full powers before he was gone. He then started talking about me. He said that he could tell that I was a healer, that I couldn't stand to see others in pain, that I would go on to heal people's minds. He told me that he wanted to give me my own personal angel, since there was so much evil in the world, and the good needs protecting. He started praying, and commanded an angel to come down and protect me. He then commanded that the angel also protect her husband across the country, and guide him in his studies, and also to protect their future children. I wasn't even supposed to see this patient. I had some free time and popped in to help out my preceptor. The only thing this patient knew about me was my first name. He had no way of knowing that my husband and I have been long distance across the country for 4 years, while he finishes his PhD, or that I'm even married in the first place, as I forgot to wear my wedding ring on that day, or that we don't have children yet. He told me that there was someone there with us, and if he could tell me about her. He said that my deceased godmother was there, and that she could see me. He said that she just kept saying, "Oh my goodness, oh my goodness," over and over again, and that she wanted me to know how proud she was of me, and how mature and professional I looked in my white coat. He said, "She never got to see you in your coat before she died. She can't get over how great you look. That she knew you would do great things." My grandmother died 2 years ago. She had never seen me in my white coat before death. In moments when she was happy or surprised, she was known to repeat "oh my goodness" over and over. The patient did not know that she was dead. He did not know anything about me. He told me that tonight I would see my angel in my bedroom, that the angel would pass by me, and I would catch a glimpse of it, and that would be my sign that I was protected. He told me not to be scared. I was finally able to successfully transition the visit back to his medical care. But before he left, he told me that he could see a goodness in me, that I just had to keep going. I called my husband and told him everything after work, and he was pretty freaked out as well. We kept trying to think of ways that this guy would have known things. This wasn't cold reading, and if it were guessing, he was pretty freaking good at it. For no reason. Who would guess that someone not only has a husband, but that he lives across the country? None of the staff there knew my personal life. I haven't talked about my husband to anyone. No one knows about my grandmother. There's no way he could have known. I gave him no feedback or confirmation while he was speaking other than the usual, "Okay, I understand," and trying to divert him back to talking about his medical care. Tonight, I was in my room listening to music, when I turned around and suddenly saw something, a foot or some sort of shape, like there were a person turning and walking out of my bedroom. I live alone. I jumped and yelped a little bit because I was freaked out. I immediately called my husband, who answered the phone with, "Did you see the angel?" I admit, as he does as well, that at this point I'm probably conditioned to see something with how freaked out I was today. But still, as my husband says, "Well dear, I guess there's just going to be things we'll never know. Worst case scenario, we're right and we're not protected by an angel. Best case scenario, everything we know is wrong and we're protected for life. Nothing bad. I don't believe in demons or people who can speak to the dead. I don't believe in God, Jesus, or angels. But I have no explanation for what happened today, and that bothers me. I left a lot of this out because it was a long visit, and so much more was said. But just be aware that I am as skeptical and science-minded as they come. So is my husband. And I don't know what to think right now. My family moved to this standard upscale suburban home after roughing it for a couple of years to save up. We also got a deal on the home because it was a model home before it was ours. Like had all the fake furniture to show off the neighborhood homes. Anyway, it had this loft area with 2 stairwells that go up to it, one in the front and one in the back. You could pretty much hear everything from the loft since it was so open. One day, my 2 best friends, one being a guy and the other being a girl, are hanging out in the loft. We were in high school, and they were horny, and always all over each other. When I was, or wasn't in the room for that matter. We were watching TV, and I get up to go to the toilet. When I left, they were all up on each other. And when I came back, they were on different ends of the couch. I just assumed that they had gotten into a fight, so I asked what was up. "Your little sister's home," the dude says. My face turned sheet white. "What's wrong?" the girl asked. I asked them what made them think that. They said they heard her. I'm sort of freaking out at this point. "No one's here," I say. We check the house, and I'm right. Well, it turns out that before it was a model home, a family lived there and a little girl had been playing in the loft, but had climbed on the railings and fell to her death below. My two best friends swear to this day that they heard what they thought was my sister's laugh and her running up the stairs, hitting her hands on each step like she was running up on all fours. I never had any encounters, other than the fact that right next to where she landed was the house's central intercom. We had an intercom system in every room that you could play music through or just talk to each other. Every so often at night, at the same time you'd wake up to the intercom button being pressed and just the blank sound of static airways, like someone was holding down the button but not speaking. My room was on the 3rd floor, and I'd have to walk down to the bottom of the main unit to turn it off there. I always thought I'd see her, but I never did. My mother died suddenly 3 years ago, 8 days before the birth of my son. There's a picture on the wall in my house of her, and he knows it's Grandma. My dad is still in that house, but we have never visited. Partly because I have a mental hang-up about going back there, and partly because of the logistics, as it's an overnight ferry. My dad visits us often, and I will go back there soon. Anyway, my son has never seen the house, and I've never shown him photos of it. He hasn't been to the village, the area, or even the country, France. I was showing him Google Maps last week, and the thing you do with your phone or tablet, where if you move the device, the field of the view moves with you. So I'm showing him our house, his other grandma's house, his school, etc. And he gets on it and has a play. My dad lives in rural France, so the Google car hasn't done a pass of his street to my knowledge. I decide to check, and it's just been done, so I drop a pin and open it up. The view opens with the house over the street. So I start to move it, and my boy shouts, "Grandma's house!" I'm a bit taken aback. I ask how he knew that. Because it is. Bit eerie. So I ask him to point at the window and say which one is the kitchen, and he puts his finger on it straight away. Which room does Daddy sleep in? Again, the finger is on it right away. Which one his grandma? He points to it and says, "It was that one." I don't know if there's a rational explanation, but it creeped me out. Has my mother reincarnated as my son? My dad, and by extension our family, were tormented by ghosts and demons. First, I need to give you a little backstory. I was young at the time, and remember very little of the actual supernatural stuff. But my dad has recounted the events of it to me before. It started when my dad was trying to get his life together. My dad had done a lot of drugs in his past, and many other things. He had been around bad crowds. He had left them and wanted to be good. A good dad to his kids. He didn't quit cold turkey though, so he still drank and was usually out of the house drinking. on one occasion, he was out drinking, and he tells me that he vividly remembers seeing a black smoke come out of his can that slowly rose until it had taken a devilish form, and then it cackled and laughed and told him that he was going to die. When my father dropped the can, the apparition disappeared. He was terrified and decided to go home, thinking he was drunk. This wouldn't be the last time something like this would happen, however. Fast forward to some time later. My dad was watching over me and my brothers one night, while my mom was away running an errand. At that point, my dad drank less. He was working more, and we had a relatively okay life. My dad was making sure that me and my brothers were taking our baths before getting ready for bed. I could do this myself, so my dad focused more on my brothers. I remember watching TV when Dad came running through the living room in boxers and a white shirt and running outside. What happened was that Dad was in my brother's bedroom and had just finished drying them off when the room had started to go black. He saw smoke fill the room that eventually turned into black nothingness. He felt weird and noticed that the skin on his arms began to move. He looked at his arms, and it looked like there was something under his skin, moving and crawling in every direction. Then he heard a voice that sounded out as a whisper that told him, in a taunting and menacing voice, to scratch his arms. He then felt a force grab him from behind, making it unable for him to run. Due to him having hung out with a tough crowd, he began to cuss at it and called whatever it was a coward, eventually breaking free, and proceeded to run outside to get the neighbor to help him. Only after escaping did he realize the implications of what had happened and the fact that we were still inside. At the time my mum was back from her errand, they both went in to find us okay and the room back to normal. Over the course of the next few months, the dark smoke would continue to creep up on my dad, wherever and whenever it could. It was a stressful time for us. I only witnessed the odd side effects of what my dad was going through, but it all stopped when we looked for help. My dad has more things that he experienced as a kid, and there's a bit more in the story than that. But that's the main thing that I will always remember. When my sister was 4 years old and I was 3, we went to visit my grandparents' summer house in the Andrianacs on a lake. My grandmother had inherited the house from her father. It was a beautiful old Victorian built in the 1880s. Once we got there, my sister started talking about a friend who she met at the house called Missy. She said Missy lived in the house. My parents assumed Missy was an imaginary friend, and at first thought the whole idea was cute. However, my sister became fixated on Missy, and the imaginary friend novelty part wore off. At some point during the visit, we drove past a graveyard, and my sister started freaking out, screaming, "Missy lives there!" My parents decided that they would take my sister to a therapist when we got home. However, my sister never brought Missy up again after we left that summer. About 20 years later, we learned that the house was originally built by a dentist. He had a brother who was a doctor who built a nearby house on a lake. That house still belonged to the family of the doctor. Our house met theirs, and they told us that the dentist who had built our house and his family had abandoned our house after his young daughter drowned off the docks. We never learned the girl's name, but I wonder if she was called Missy. When I was little, we lived on an airbase. My father was in the RAF, and at this point in time was stationed on the Falklands, 8,000 miles away. I was playing at the bottom of the stairs, while my mum sat with my younger sister who was ill in the living room. She could see me, and she was about 5 meters away at most. And it was just us three, our 2 dogs and cat. I'd been playing for a while when I heard a man's voice, though what he said I have forgotten. I look up the stairs, and there stood a man in what I know now to be an RAF sergeant uniform from World War II. To me, he looked like my father in his dress uniform, and I just said, "Dad?" putting down my toys. My mother, at first confused, asked me who I was speaking to. "Dad's on the stairs," I exclaimed, and she started to hurry to me, but I was wrapped on the man. He had dark hair, but his eyes were brown, not blue. He wasn't as tall as my father either, and he was looking right at me. He was also too pale, smudges under his eyes that made him look like a corpse. Luckily, I hadn't seen one of those at that point in my life. Just as my mother swept me up and looked up the stairs, he smiled a lopsided grin and waved his fingers at me before he turned and walked off up the stairs behind him. He vanished after 2 steps. There is also another story that happened to me. My sister and I were walking our dogs along a local footpath. It goes through an old graveyard for about 200 yards. It was full daylight. We'd walked this way loads of times, and nothing had ever happened. It's an old place. Some of the markers are those tall monolithic type things about 6 feet high. My old dog, Beef, went from his usual chill self to his hackles rising and a deep growl coming from him. He was staring at one of those tall gravestones, one just off the path. Our other dog, Spot, joined in. Our lovely calm childhood dogs were in full attack mode, which was almost as frightening as what we saw next. We stood dumbfounded at this change, only for a moment. I was looking at the stone, and the hairs on my arms began lifting up. I could see behind the stones a dark figure. It was ducked behind the sandstone grave marker, and I couldn't see any specific features. I could not see whether it was a shadow or if it was an actual creepy person just staring at us. Needless to say, we bolted. We ran all the way home, locked the doors, and never walked that way again. My brother and I are children of divorce, and our parents live in different countries. We live with our mother and went to see our father for the holidays. I was about 12 and my brother was 14. I hadn't brought anything to do during the flight, so was pretty bored. We were near the end of the flight, and I had been drowsing, drifting in and out of sleep for the majority of the flight, as was my brother. I opened my eyes and saw that we had landed. Looking out the window, I see we are just sitting on the tarmac, in a field of green surrounded by trees. Looking around the plane, I see my brother asleep next to me, and so are the rest of the passengers. I think nothing of this, and after a minute or two, with nothing happening, I close my eyes again. I awake once more, to see that we are in the clouds making our landing. My brother is still asleep, but others are awake. We land, and all is normal. We get off the plane, collect our luggage, and meet up with our mother. We're in the car, just starting the ride home, and my mother is asking us standard questions about the flight. I mention the fact we landed and took off again, and my brother looks at me like I'm an idiot. He insists it was a dream, and that it couldn't possibly have happened. I explained he was asleep at the time, to which he points out I was asleep most of the flight. After defending myself for a few minutes, I realize it does sound ridiculous, and drop the subject. Perhaps 5 minutes later down the road, we see a Ryanair plane in the field on our right behind some trees. We all stare at it for a few moments. Maybe you did land earlier, Mum says. My brother doesn't say anything, and after a few minutes of silence, we move on talking about the holiday, and it's never brought up again. It's definitely the only unexplained event in my life. I went on a Halloween supernatural tour of Crumlin Road Jail in Belfast. I don't believe in ghosts, and I'm sure there are rational explanations, but some strange things happened. There is an underground tunnel leading from the jail to the courthouse across the road. This was the first stop on the tour. The guide was further up the tunnel, conducting experiments, and the guy in front of me kept leaning forwards, casting a shadow over my eyeline. Though, when the tour guide returned up the corridor with his torch and lit up my general vicinity, I noticed the guy was in front and a good few paces up, and shouldn't have been able to obscure my vision like that. The next stop was the pitch black boiler room. I felt a breeze to the right of me, looked around, and thought I could see a hearth or fireplace when my eyes adjusted to the dark, which would explain the breeze. After the guide instructed us, we could turn on our phone torches. There was no hearth nor fireplace where the breeze could be coming from. Finally, In the corridor where all the cells were, the guide explained it was haunted by a young boy. The guide was standing at one side of the corridor, looking down one side of a staircase in the middle. The tour group were crowded on that side of the corridor, and I couldn't get in a position to see. I decided to stand on the opposite side of the corridor and look down the other side of the staircase. I saw something peek around the staircase as the guide was talking. I decided, despite being skeptical, that if this were a child, the best thing to do would be to smile and wave at it. The instant I did this, the figure quickly dipped back behind the staircase, and the rest of the crowd freaked out as they all swore they saw a figure move, quickly darting from their side of the staircase and zoom down the corridor away from them. The guide even looked a bit weirded out. We were taken around other places in the jail, but nothing else happened. Great tour, and I'd highly recommend it, if only for the history lesson. I think this may have been an episode of sleep paralysis, but when it happened, and still thinking about it, I do genuinely believe that something supernatural was going on. I was very close to my cousins growing up, and would often stay the night at their house on weekends and summer breaks. This particular summer, I would say I was around 19 or 20, so not a young kid. They had just moved into a new house in a nice neighborhood. Things were still being unpacked, and while everybody else had a room to sleep, I opted to sleep in the living room, on the couch facing the living room window. I vividly remember having some type of horrifying experience in the middle of the night that still scares me to this day. I was jolted awake in the dead of night with this feeling that there was someone else in the room. It immediately felt like there was something wrong, something evil. I didn't feel safe, and the next thing I know, I'm looking down at my rigid body on the couch. It seemed as if I was looking through the eyes of something that was staring down at me maliciously. A feeling of panic rushed over me. It felt as if someone was sitting on my chest and squeezing my throat. It was then I realized that I couldn't move. I tried to speak. My mouth wouldn't move. I tried to scream for help, but my jaws were clenched shut. In the midst of all this and more, I tried to stop it. The greater the feeling of evil became. Now, this is the part that gets really weird. I grew up in a Christian home, and I had a grandmother that was very religious and believed in evil spirits. She repeatedly mentioned, growing up, that if I were ever in danger or felt scared, to just speak the name of Jesus. Well, that night, in the midst of fear, I somehow was able to scream Jesus through my clenched teeth. As soon as the word came out, a huge rush of wind came blowing through the windows, and the curtains flew up, and they all blew around very loudly. Suddenly, the feeling of something evil was gone, and I could move again. it was the creepiest thing. Keep in mind, I am not a super religious person, but I do believe in ghosts and evil forces. Not sure if that was just a really bad dream, or what, but it definitely terrified the shit out of me. Something similar also happened to an acquaintance of mine. It was his dad. He has since passed, but I remember that he told me that while he and his sisters and mother were out of the country visiting her family, he stayed home due to his health. One night, he felt something evil and saw something dark coming from the doorway of his bedroom and rushing towards him. He told me that he thought it was a demon, and once he yelled something along the lines of, "In Jesus' name, I command you to leave," or something like that. After he yelled that, he said whatever it was disappeared. As far as I know, he never had any sleep issues, and this was one of the few times I'd ever heard him talking about paranormalish stuff. We wish we could ask him about it now, but he has sadly passed away. As a kid, throughout my teenage years, I had friends in the neighborhood that I hung out with all the time. There was an old lady down the street who we called Granny Shay. I would go visit Shay to swing on her tire swing and to play with her cats, crows and kittens, as she always fed the strays and birds, so they were friendly. Granny Shay loved me, but hated the other kids. They were mean to her cats and ruined her garden. Shay passed away when I was in high school, and her granddaughter rented a room in the house to one of my childhood friends. One of the boys that Shay had disliked so strongly. One night, the granddaughter was away, and my friend had a small party at Shay's house. We were sitting in his room when he told us that Shay had died on the very bed we were sitting on. Being teens, some of the guests started yelling for Shay's spirit to show herself, taunting her and saying that she was dumb for dying and stupid stuff like that. I got uncomfortable and stood up to leave. Before I got to the door though, the lights in the room shut off. I was next to the switch and flipped it back on, but as I went to do so, I discovered that the lights were already on the on position. So, I turned the switch down and the lights came back on. Then they immediately turned back off again, and I turned them on once more. Then the light switch started rapidly going from on to off, even though I was no longer touching the switch. Some of the people in the room yelled at me to stop messing with them. The light turned back on without a feeling of finality. On the wall above the bed was a black handprint that had not been there before. We yelled and ran out of the room. I ran back home and have never set foot back in that house since. Bonus story. I was a new nurse, and I was assigned a patient that was classified as difficult. This is very common with new nurses, and to be honest, I was fully expecting a big challenge or responsibility when I joined. When I first met her, I was quite afraid. I thought she was going to be a handful, and she was going to make my life a living hell. But as things go, she didn't turn out to be difficult at all. It was quite the opposite, in fact. I really got along well with her, and we honestly struck a good chord. Sadly though, she had recently been diagnosed with cancer. So if she had her bad days, it was to be expected. We spoke a great deal about my life, her fears, our silly stuff, and so on. It was fantastic conversation. Sometimes I think you need to take a step back and just speak with people to make this genuine connection. But I digress. She went home, but returned several times over the year for treatment and so on. During that year, I was fortunate enough to meet a very lovely guy. He is a gentleman, and things got rather serious very quickly, something which I feel very blessed for. The next time I saw her, I explained to her that despite the short amount of time, I was going to get married, and I really wanted her to attend the wedding. And she was going to. Everything was going fine. At one point, we even thought that she was recovering. But alas, it was not meant to be. She got sick and needed to be in the hospital. So, as a gesture, my entire wedding party joined me in her hospital room to wish her well. She was so surprised and so happy, and honestly that meant the world to me. So after the wedding, we of course went on our honeymoon. It was absolutely fantastic. And when we returned, I was absolutely crushed to discover that she had died. During the year we were getting to know one another, I lived in a small apartment that was already cramped for one person, let alone a couple. But we were poor and tried to work it out. After half a year of not having enough room, I decided to check for new apartments to rent. There was a place near enough to work that I could walk, and it was so much bigger, and it had a garage. And you know what? It was cheaper than our little place. The one drawback is that we didn't have enough furniture. But family and friends chipped in, and we moved in a few weeks later. We loved having enough room to actually have guests. We had parents over for meals, and friends often congregated at our place. We had one friend that kept telling us the place was haunted, but it didn't seem like a mean ghost, if it were haunted anyway. Like any house, you would hear the occasional strange noise, but I would always attribute it to the wooden floorboards, or perhaps the pipe, the water. I always assigned it a reason. That was until we heard funny knocks. But, going with what we had before, we didn't pay it much mind. One day, out of coincidence, everything was going fine and well in the new house, and we were so extremely happy. When all of a sudden one day, I got a mail for the former tenant. And I'm sure you all know the punchline. Yes, it was my former patient's apartment. The weird thing is, it had to have been empty for about 6 months. And I can't understand why it had been vacant for such a long time. And honestly, it still puzzles me. Or maybe, just maybe, it was meant to be. And she was keeping an eye on it for me. Who knows? In my mind, I take it as if this was her wedding gift to us. And I am very, very grateful.